There comes a moment in every life when all the wealth and power in the world cannot fill the emptiness inside your heart. For Queen Sigrún, that moment arrived on a cold winter night, when she realized that 20 years of ruling had left her. With everything except the one thing she truly needed, someone who saw her not as a queen, but simply as a woman. In her great hall, she made an offer that shocked everyone. 511 acres of her richest land to the giant Viking warrior Bjorn Thorsson for just one night together. The hall went silent. But what Bjorn said in response would change both their lives. Forever. He didn't want her land, he didn't want her gold. What he wanted was something far more precious, something that couldn't be bought or traded. What did this battle-scarred warrior ask for instead that left the most powerful woman in the north speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the carved dragon heads that adorned the great hall's oak beams, their wooden eyes seeming to watch over the assembled warriors and nobles with ancient wisdom. Queen Sigrún sat upon her high throne, a seat carved from a single massive oak tree that had stood for 3 centuries before being transformed into this symbol of power. The golden seal ring upon her finger, a ring that bore the mark of royal authority and had sealed countless decrees of life and death, caught the firelight as she absently turned it around and around, a habit she'd developed during the long, solitary years since her husband's passing. At 52 winters, Sigrún remained a striking woman, though the years of ruling had etched fine lines around her piercing blue eyes and touched her auburn hair with silver. She had learned to carry herself with the rigid bearing that command demanded, shoulders always straight, chin always lifted, never showing weakness or uncertainty. Yet tonight, as she gazed across the hall filled with celebrating warriors returned from successful raids, she felt the familiar ache of isolation that no amount of respect or fear could ease. The great hall itself told the story of her reign. When she had inherited the throne 20 winters ago, after her husband King Harold fell in battle against Saxon raiders, this room had been a place of chaos and uncertainty. Now, tapestries depicting her victories adorned the stone walls, and the long tables groaned under the weight of silver plates and golden drinking horns. She had built this prosperity through careful diplomacy and shrewd trade agreements, transforming what had been a struggling kingdom into one of the most prosperous in the northern lands. But prosperity, she had learned, was a cold companion in the dark hours before dawn. My queen, came the familiar voice of Astrid, her most trusted advisor and the closest thing she had to a friend. The older woman approached with the measured steps that courtly protocol demanded, though her weathered face bore the concern of someone who had known Sigrún since girlhood. The warriors grow restless. They expect you to speak, to honor their victories. Sigrún nodded slowly, her gaze still scanning the assembled men. These were good warriors, brave and loyal, but they looked at her as their sovereign, never simply as a woman who might share their joys and sorrows. Even in celebration, she remained apart, elevated, untouchable. It was then that her eyes fell upon a figure who stood apart from the others, leaning against one of the great stone pillars that supported the hall's vaulted ceiling. Bjorn Thorsson was impossible to miss, not merely because of his towering height, which made him stand head and shoulders above even the tallest warriors, but because of the quiet presence he carried. Unlike the others who had drunk deeply of mead and boasted loudly of their exploits, he stood silent, his weathered hands wrapped around a simple wooden cup. Bjorn had seen 45 winters, and each one had left its mark upon his broad frame. His beard, once golden like summer wheat, now bore streaks of silver that spoke of battles fought and comrades lost. His hands, calloused from decades of wielding sword and shield, bore the scars that marked a true warrior, not the fresh, proudly displayed wounds of young fighters, but the deep, old marks of a man who had survived when many others had not. Most striking of all was the sword at his side, a blade he called grief-biter, for the sorrow it had witnessed and caused. The weapon's leather-wrapped hilt was worn smooth by countless battles, and its steel bore the nicks and scratches of desperate fights. Yet Bjorn wore it not with pride, but with the weight of remembrance. Each mark on that blade represented a choice made, a life taken, a moment when survival demanded the sacrifice of his soul's peace. "That one troubles me," Astrid murmured, following the Queen's gaze. "Bjorn Thorsson has a reputation that precedes him. They say he can cleave a man in two with a single blow, that he has never retreated from any battle, and yet he stands alone." "While others celebrate," Sigrún observed, studying the way Bjorn's grey eyes seemed to look through the revelry rather than at it. "Why do you suppose that is?" Astrid shifted uncomfortably. "Some say he grows weary of the warrior's life, that he questions the glory we're taught to seek in battle. Such thoughts can be dangerous, my queen. A warrior who doubts may inspire others to doubt." But Sigrún found herself intrigued rather than concerned. In Bjorn's stillness, she recognized something she had not expected to find in her hall. A kindred spirit who understood the weight of making decisions that others could not bear. While his warriors celebrated victories, he bore the burden of the costs those victories had demanded. The whole celebration continued around them, but Sigrún felt as though she and Bjorn existed in a bubble of shared understanding. She watched as Eric Ironarm, Bjorn's shield brother and closest friend, approached with a horn of mead, trying to draw his companion into the festivity. Bjorn accepted the drink with a grateful nod, but set it aside after only a small sip, his attention returning to some distant thought that the others could not see. Eric was everything Bjorn was not in terms of temperament: quick to laugh, eager for glory, comfortable with the adulation that followed their victories. He embodied the traditional Viking ideal of the joyous warrior, living fully in each moment of triumph. Yet even Eric seemed to sense his friend's growing distance from the life they had always known. "Bjorn has been like this since the battle. At Lindisfarne," Eric confided to another warrior, his voice carrying across the hall in the way that ale-loosened tongues often do. "We won a great victory there, captured riches beyond counting. But he spoke little during the journey home, said the screams of the women and children would not leave his ears." Sigrún felt her heart clench at these words. She had heard reports of Lindisfarne, of course, a monastery rich in gold and treasures, poorly defended, an easy target for Viking raiders. Such raids had built her kingdom's wealth, filled her treasury with silver and her granaries with grain seized from conquered lands. But she had never considered the weight such victories might place upon the souls of those who won them. The queen rose from her throne, and immediately the hall began to quiet, conversations trailing off as all eyes turned toward her. This was the moment when she was expected to speak of glory and honor, to praise the warriors for their courage and promise them greater victories to come. The words were as familiar to her as breathing, polished through years of repetition until they had lost all meaning. But tonight, with Bjorn's grey eyes upon her, she found those empty phrases sticking in her throat. "My brave warriors," she began, her voice carrying easily across the hall, trained by years of addressing councils and armies. "You have returned victorious once again, your ships heavy with the fruits of conquest. Our kingdom grows stronger. With each season, our reputation spreads across the northern seas like fire across dry grass." The warriors cheered, raising their horns and beating their fists upon the wooden tables. Yet Sigrún noticed that Bjorn did not join in the celebration. He simply watched her with those penetrating eyes, as if he could see through the royal ceremony to the woman beneath. "But victory," she continued, her voice taking on a more thoughtful tone, "is not measured only in silver and gold. True victory lies in knowing why we fight, in understanding what we preserve through our struggles." The hall grew quieter, warriors exchanging glances. This was not the usual speech they expected from their queen. "We fight to protect those we love," Sigrún said, her gaze finding Bjorn's across the crowded hall. "We fight to preserve the bonds that make life worth living. We fight so that future generations might know peace, even if we ourselves may never find it." For the first time that evening, Bjorn moved, straightening from his casual lean against the pillar. Their eyes met across the distance, and Sigrún felt a jolt of recognition. Here was someone who understood the loneliness of leadership, the burden of choices that others would never have to make. The formal part of the evening concluded with the traditional toasts and blessings. But Sigrún's thoughts remained fixed on the tall warrior who had listened to her words with such intensity. As the crowd began to disperse, some warriors seeking their beds while others gathered around smaller fires to continue their drinking and storytelling, she made a decision that would have shocked her younger self. "Astrid," she called to her advisor who had remained close throughout the evening, "send word to Bjorn Thorsson. Tell him I would speak with him privately." Astrid's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "My queen, is that wise? To summon a warrior to private audience without witnesses, or—" "I am not summoning him as his queen," Sigrún interrupted gently. "I am asking him to speak with me as one person to another. There is a difference." As Astrid hurried away to deliver the message, Sigrún remained in the great hall, watching the flames dance in the central hearth. The carved dragons overhead seemed to nod their approval, as if they too understood that some conversations required the setting aside of crowns and titles, the meeting of souls, rather than the negotiation of rulers and subjects. The golden seal ring continued to turn upon her finger, but tonight it felt less like a symbol of power and more like a barrier between herself and the connection she had spent 20 years learning to crave. Tonight, perhaps, she would discover whether one other person in her kingdom saw her as more than a queen, to be feared and obeyed. Tonight, she would learn whether Bjorn Thorsson was the companion her heart had been seeking, or merely another warrior who would see only the crown upon her head and the power it represented. The great hall had emptied of most warriors, leaving only the closest advisors and household guards when Bjorn approached Queen Sigrún's throne. His footsteps echoed against the stone floor, each sound seeming to emphasize the magnitude of this unusual summons. No common warrior, no matter how renowned, was typically granted private audience with the queen without formal ceremony or pressing state business. Sigrún had dismissed most of her court, but protocol demanded that some witnesses remain. Astrid stood at her customary position beside the throne, while 2 guards flanked the great doors. The ancient land charter scroll, parchment that detailed every acre, every boundary stone, every stream and forest that comprised her vast holdings, lay, rolled upon a nearby table, brought forth earlier during discussions of territorial disputes with neighboring kingdoms. "Your Majesty," Bjorn said, executing a perfect bow despite his obvious discomfort with formal court manners. Even in this simple gesture, his warrior's bearing was unmistakable, controlled, precise, but carrying an undercurrent of barely contained. "Empower, please sit." Sigrún gestured to a carved chair that servants had positioned near the throne. "I find these conversations go better when we can look upon each other as equals." Bjorn's grey eyes registered surprise at this breach of protocol, but he took the offered seat. Up close, Sigrún could see the details that distance had obscured. The way his hands, despite their obvious strength, trembled slightly when at rest, a veteran's sign of battles that still echoed in flesh and bone. The scar that traced from his left temple to his jaw, nearly hidden by his beard, but visible in the firelight. Most telling of all, the way his gaze seemed to look through rather than at the displays of wealth surrounding them. "You fought at Lindisfarne," she began, not as a question but as acknowledgement. "I did, Your Majesty." His voice carried a weight that victories should not bear. "Eric speaks of great triumph there. Gold enough to fill 3 ships, treasures beyond counting." Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped before him. When he spoke, his words came carefully, as if he were navigating dangerous waters. There was gold, yes, and other things as well. Sigrún leaned forward slightly, drawn by something in his tone. What other things? Fear in the eyes of old monks who had never held weapons, children hiding behind their mothers' skirts. The sound a man makes when he prays to his God, while knowing his prayer will not be answered. Bjorn's gaze met hers directly. These too were part of what we found at Lindisfarne. The honesty of his response struck her like a physical blow. In 20 years of ruling, no warrior had ever spoken to her of the costs of victory, only its rewards. They brought her silver and gold, prisoners to be ransomed or sold, reports of enemy strength diminished, and borders secured. But none had ever spoken of the human weight of their actions. And yet you continue to fight, she observed. I continue to survive, he corrected. There is a difference, though I sometimes forget what it is. Something in his words opened a door. Within Sigrún's chest, a space that had been sealed since Harald's death. Here was a man who understood that survival and living were not the same thing, who carried burdens that glory could not lighten. Here was someone who might understand the choices that kept her awake in the dark hours before dawn. The guards and Astrid maintained their positions, but Sigrún felt as though she and Bjorn had stepped into a private space where crowns and titles held no meaning. In that moment of connection, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible, even moments before. I have a proposition for you, Bjorn Thorsson, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. Your Majesty? Sigrún rose from her throne and walked to the table where the land charter lay rolled in its leather binding. The document represented not just territory, but the foundation of her power, fertile fields that fed her people, forests that provided timber for ships, streams that turned the wheels of mills that ground grain into flour and gold. 511 acres of the richest land in her domain, territory that could support a small army or provide wealth enough to last several lifetimes. These lands, she said, unrolling the charter so that the detailed maps and boundary descriptions were visible, represent more wealth than most men see in a lifetime. They could make you the equal of any lord in the northern kingdoms. Bjorn studied the documents, his weathered finger tracing the careful lines that marked streams and hills. Your Majesty, I am honored by your trust, but I do not understand. I offer them to you, Sigrún interrupted, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. All of this freely given, with no obligation save none. The hall fell absolutely silent. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if the very air was holding its breath. One night, she continued, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest, spend one night with me, not as queen and warrior, not as ruler and subject, but simply as woman and man. In exchange, these lands become yours with no other claim. Upon them, Astrid gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. The guards shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unsure where to look or how to respond to such an unprecedented breach of royal protocol. The scandal of it would spread through the kingdom before morning. A queen offering lands and herself to a common warrior, no matter how renowned. But Sigrún's attention was entirely focused on Bjorn's face, watching for his response to her. Desperate gamble. She had offered him wealth beyond imagining, more than most warriors could earn through a lifetime of raids and battles. She had also offered him something that no amount of gold could purchase, the intimacy of a woman who had forgotten what it meant to be touched, not from duty or political necessity, but from simple human need. Bjorn stared at the land charter, for a long moment, his fingers still tracing the boundaries of the offered territory. When he finally looked up, his grey eyes held something she had not expected to see, not desire or greed or triumph, but a deep, abiding sadness. Your Majesty, he said quietly, you honor me beyond my worth with this offer. These lands could provide security for my remaining years, wealth enough to ensure I never again need to draw sword in anger. Hope flared in Sigrún's chest, but Something in his tone warned her that his words were building toward rejection rather than acceptance. "But I cannot accept," he continued, rising from his chair and stepping away from the table. "Not as you have offered it." The silence that followed was deafening. Sigrún felt the weight of every eye in the hall upon her, the magnitude of her public rejection settling like a stone in her stomach. She had offered a warrior everything she had to give, wealth, land, and herself, and he had found it wanting. "Then, what would you accept?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the hushed hall. Bjorn took a step closer to her, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his weathered face, the years of hard choices that had carved lines around his eyes. When he spoke, his words were not those of a subject addressing his queen, but of one human being speaking truth to another. "I would ask not for one night purchased with gold and land, but for however many days or nights you might freely choose, to spend in the company of someone who sees you not as a queen to be feared or obeyed, but simply as Sigrún, a woman who has forgotten what it means to be valued for herself rather than her crown." The hall erupted in shocked whispers. Guards looked at each other uncertainly, unsure whether they had just witnessed treason or the most romantic gesture in the kingdom's history. Astrid stood frozen, her face cycling through expressions of horror, amazement, and something that might have been approval. But Sigrún heard nothing except the pounding of her own heart, and the echo of words that no one had spoken to her in 20 years. Not since Harald's death had anyone seen her as simply Sigrún. Not since her coronation had anyone offered her the gift of their presence without expecting payment in return. "You would refuse 500 acres of the richest land in the kingdom," she said slowly, "for conversation." "I would refuse any amount of land bought with loneliness," Bjorn replied. "Yours or mine." And in that moment, standing before her throne, with the charter of her wealth spread between them like a bridge she no longer needed to cross, Queen Sigrún realized that this battle-scarred warrior had just offered her something infinitely more valuable than the gold and silver that filled her treasury. He had offered her the possibility of being known. The carved wooden chess set had been a gift from a Byzantine trader 3 summers past, its pieces crafted from dark walnut and pale birch in the likeness of kings and queens, knights and warriors. Tonight, it sat between Sigrún and Bjorn on a small table near the great fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows across the intricate figures as they contemplated their moves with the careful attention of true strategists. 2 hours had passed since the hall had emptied of witnesses, since Astrid had reluctantly withdrawn with the guards, after Sigrún assured her that this unconventional conversation would continue under proper supervision. The proper supervision, as it turned out, consisted of the ancient dragons carved into the hall's beams, silent sentinels who had overseen countless royal conversations across the centuries. "Your move reveals much about you," Bjorn observed, studying the board where Sigrún had just advanced her queen in a bold gambit that left her king temporarily vulnerable. "You are willing to risk everything on a single decisive action." Sigrún smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure she had worn in months. "And your response tells me you understand patience. You could have taken my queen immediately, but you chose to strengthen your position instead. Taking the queen would have won the game, but it would have ended our conversation," Bjorn replied, moving a knight to a seemingly defensive position that actually set up a complex attack. 3 moves hence. "I find I am in no hurry for this evening to conclude." The fire crackled between them, filling the comfortable silence as Sigrún considered both the chessboard and the man across from her. Without the formal protocols of court, without the weight of crown and ceremony, she found herself relaxing in ways she had forgotten were possible. Bjorn had removed his sword belt, setting Griefbiter aside with the reverent care of a man who understood the burden of carrying death, and rolled up his sleeves to reveal arms marked with the pale lines of old battle scars. "Tell me about your first battle," she said, moving a bishop to threaten his king's position while leaving her own forces dangerously exposed. Bjorn's hands stilled on his captured pawn, his grey eyes growing distant. I was 16, young enough to believe that glory was something you could hold in your hands like treasure. My father had died the winter before, and I was eager to prove myself worthy of his memory. And did you find the glory you sought? A bitter smile touched Bjorn's weathered features. I found blood and mud, and the sound of grown men weeping for their mothers. But I also found something else. The moment when fear leaves you, when survival becomes instinct rather than thought. There is a terrible peace in that moment, and a terrible cost. Sigrún nodded, understanding more than he might expect. I know that moment, though I found it not in battle, but in the council chambers, when I realized that every decision I made would determine who lived and who died, which families would prosper, and which would face hardship. The crown is its own kind of warfare, Bjorn agreed, castling his king to safety, while simultaneously positioning his rook for a devastating attack. But you chose to wear it, did I? Sigrún laughed softly, but there was no humor in the sound. Harold died on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the council had placed the crown upon my head and expected me to make decisions about grain distribution that would affect thousands of people. Choice, I learned, is a luxury that queens rarely possess. Bjorn leaned back, in his chair, studying her face in the firelight. Yet here you are, choosing to spend your evening playing chess with a warrior instead of reviewing tax ledgers or receiving petitions. Yes, she admitted, feeling heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. Here I am, making perhaps the first truly selfish choice I have allowed myself in 20 years. Their conversation was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps in the corridor beyond the hall's great doors. Both tensed instinctively, Bjorn's hand moving toward where his sword would normally rest, Sigrún straightening into the rigid posture of royal authority. But the steps passed by without pause, some servant or guard going about their nighttime duties, unaware of the unprecedented scene unfolding in their queen's hall. They will talk, you know, Sigrún said quietly, once the footsteps had faded. By morning, every person in the castle will know that Queen Sigrún spent the evening in private conversation with Bjorn Thorsson. The stories will grow with each telling. Does that concern you? She considered this, moving her remaining knight to a position that offered both protection and attack possibilities. It should. A queen's reputation is as important as her army, in maintaining order. But tonight, I find I care less about what they will say than about what you are thinking. Bjorn's response was to move his queen, not to attack, but to a central square where she could support his other pieces while remaining protected. I am thinking that you play chess like you rule, with bold strokes tempered by careful consideration of consequences. I'm also thinking that the woman sitting across from me is far more interesting than the queen who sits upon that throne. The compliment struck her like a physical blow, so unexpected after years of formal flattery that served political purposes rather than emotional truth. You barely know me. I know that you offered a warrior wealth beyond imagining and did not flinch. When he refused it, I know that you ask about the costs of victory rather than simply celebrating its rewards. I know that you choose to spend your leisure time contemplating strategy rather than listening to musicians sing of your greatness. Sigrún felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, truly seen for the first time in decades. And I know that you carry your sword like a burden rather than a trophy, that you speak of fear and loss with the honesty of someone who has learned wisdom through suffering. They played in comfortable silence for several moves, each lost in thoughts that had little to do with the wooden pieces on the board between them. The chess game had become secondary to the larger contest they were engaged in, the careful dance of two souls circling each other, testing for sincerity, probing for the possibility of genuine connection. Checkmate, Bjorn said quietly, though His tone held no triumph. Sigrún looked down at the board, seeing how his seemingly defensive moves had constructed an inescapable trap around her king. She had been so focused on their conversation, so caught up in the pleasure of being truly heard, that she had missed the elegant strategy developing across the wooden battlefield. "Well played," she said, though her smile suggested she had lost. Nothing that mattered. "Shall we play another?" "If you wish," Bjorn replied, beginning to reset the pieces with careful precision. "Though I should warn you, I rarely lose twice to the same opponent. Then I shall have to ensure our next game is played on a battlefield where I hold the advantage," Sigrún said, her eyes meeting his across the flickering candlelight. "Tell me, Bjorn Thorsson, do you know anything about the art of conversation between two people who have forgotten how to be anything other than the roles they play for others?" His laugh was rich and genuine, the sound of a man remembering what joy felt like. "I know nothing about it, Your Majesty, but I find myself eager to learn." The morning sun cast long shadows across the royal gardens as Sigrún made her customary dawn walk among the herb beds and flowering shrubs that had been her private sanctuary since the early days of her reign. But today, for the first time in 20 years, she did not walk alone. Bjorn moved beside her with the measured pace of a man accustomed to long marches, his presence both comforting and unsettling in ways she was still learning to understand. The war horn that had belonged to her late husband Harold hung from her belt, a silver-chased instrument that had once called warriors to battle and now served as a symbol of the courage she had needed to rebuild herself after his death. This morning, its weight felt different somehow, less like a burden and more like a reminder of resilience. "The gardens were Harold's idea originally," she said, pausing beside a patch of chamomile whose delicate flowers released their sweet fragrance into the cool morning air. "He said a queen needed a place where she could remember what she was protecting, where the responsibilities of rule didn't follow her." Bjorn knelt to examine a cluster of sage plants, his weathered fingers gentle among the silvery leaves. "A wise man. The earth has a way of reminding us what truly matters when we spend too much time thinking about gold and conquest." "Do you garden?" she asked, surprised by this unexpected tenderness in a man whose reputation spoke only of warfare. "My grandmother taught me when I was young," he admitted, rising with a small sprig of mint that he offered to her. "She said that any man who could only destroy had learned only half of what life had to teach." Sigrún accepted the mint, crushing it gently between her fingers to release its sharp, clean scent. "And what did she teach you about creation?" "That it requires patience, attention, and the willingness to tend something day after day without expecting immediate reward." His grey eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Much like trust between two people, I imagine." They walked deeper into the garden, following paths that Sigrún had traced countless times in solitude, but which seemed entirely new when shared with another. The morning air carried the sounds of the castle awakening, servants beginning their duties, guards changing shifts, the distant ring of hammer on anvil from the smithy. But here among the growing things, these sounds felt distant and unimportant. "I dreamed of him again last night," Sigrún said suddenly, then stopped, surprised by her own admission. She had not spoken of the dreams to anyone, not even Astrid. Bjorn waited patiently, understanding that some confidences required time to emerge fully. "Harold appears to me sometimes in sleep, always at the moment of his death. He reaches toward me as the Saxon blade finds his heart, and I wake with the certainty that I should have been there, should have found some way to save him." She touched the war horn at her side, its metal warm from her body's heat. "The dreams have grown more frequent recently." "Survivor's guilt," Bjorn said quietly. "I know it well. After every battle I would lie awake thinking of the men who fell beside me, wondering why my sword was quick enough to save my life, but not theirs. How do you bear it?" Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "I learned to honor their memory by living in ways that justified my survival. Not through seeking greater glory or accumulating more treasure, but by trying to become worthy of the gift their deaths had given me. The chance to continue, to choose better, to find meaning in the years they would never have. They paused, beside a small fountain where water bubbled up from carved stone to feed the garden beds. The sound was soothing, a gentle counterpoint to the weight of their conversation. Sigrún found herself studying Bjorn's profile, noting the way the morning light revealed the depth of the lines around his eyes, the careful way he held his scarred hands. "Is that why you grow weary of raiding?" she asked. "Because you seek to honor the dead through different choices." "Perhaps," he admitted. "Or perhaps I simply grow old and foolish, preferring the company of growing things to the chaos of battle." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "There was a boy at Lindisfarne, no more than 12 summers. He stood between his mother and my sword, trembling but determined to protect her." Sigrún felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. "I could have cut him down without effort. He had no weapon, no training, nothing but courage and love for his mother. Instead, I found myself stepping back, telling him to take her and run." Bjorn's hands clenched at his sides. "That moment changed something in me. I realized that true strength might lie not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to choose when destruction serves no purpose." "What happened to them?" "They escaped. Other warriors might have pursued them, but I told my men they had fled toward the cliffs where the footing was treacherous. A small lie, perhaps, but one that let me sleep without adding their voices to. The chorus of the dead that visits my dreams." Sigrún reached out impulsively, covering his clenched fist with her hand. His skin was warm, rough with calluses and crossed with old scars, but steady and solid in ways that her world of political maneuvering rarely offered. "You are not foolish," she said firmly. "You are becoming wise, which is far more dangerous. To those who profit from endless warfare." Bjorn's eyes widened slightly at her touch, but he did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand palm up, letting her fingers rest against his calloused skin. "And you? Do you grow weary of the choices that ruling demands?" "Every day," she admitted. "But I have learned that weariness and duty are not incompatible. The question is whether I will spend my remaining years serving only the crown, or whether I might dare to remember what it feels like to be simply human." They stood together in the growing morning light, her pale hand resting in his weathered palm, the war horn at her side, catching the sun's rays like a promise of the courage that had brought them both to this moment. Around them, the garden bloomed, with life that required tending, patience, and the daily choice to nurture rather than destroy. "Bjorn," she said softly, "when you spoke last night of seeing me as simply Sigrún rather than as queen, did you mean it?" His fingers tightened gently around hers. "I have never spoken words I meant more deeply." "Then perhaps," she said, her heart beating so hard she was certain he could hear it, "we might spend some part of each day learning what that means." 3 days had passed since the evening that had changed everything, and the castle hummed with whispered conversations that ceased abruptly whenever Sigrún entered a room. She could feel the weight of speculation following her through the corridors, see the carefully neutral expressions that her courtiers wore when they thought she wasn't watching. But for the first time in her reign, the gossip of others seemed less important than the quiet anticipation she felt each morning when she woke, knowing that the day would bring another opportunity to discover more about the complex man who had refused her gold. The ancient runestone map lay spread across a wooden table in the castle's oldest tower, its carved symbols weathered by centuries but still clearly readable to those who understood the old ways. Sigrún had discovered it years ago in a forgotten chamber, a relic from the time when her ancestors had first claimed these lands. Today, she had brought Bjorn here to share this piece of her history, though she found herself more interested in watching his face as he studied the ancient markings than in the stones themselves. These symbols marked not just territories, but safe passages, Bjorn observed, tracing the carved lines with one careful finger. Your ancestors were not just conquerors. They were explorers, seeking to understand the land they claimed, rather than simply dominate it. My great-grandmother ruled these lands when this map was carved, Sigrún said, settling beside him on the stone bench that had been placed near the table. The stories say she could read the land like other people read runes, that she knew which valleys would flood in spring and which hills would shelter her people from winter storms. And you? Bjorn asked, his attention shifting from the map to her face. Do you have that gift? Sigrún considered this, her fingers finding the edge of the runestone where generations of hands had worn the granite smooth. I have learned to read the political landscape, to sense when alliances might shift, when neighboring kingdoms grow restless, when my own nobles begin to question my decisions. But the land itself? She shook her head. I see it through tax, records and grain yields, through strategic advantages and defensive positions. I fear I have lost the connection my ancestors took for granted. Or perhaps you simply need someone to help you remember how to look, Bjorn suggested gently. Before she could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps on the tower stairs announced the arrival of visitors. Sigrún straightened instinctively, her body assuming the formal posture that 20 years of rule had made automatic, but Bjorn's presence beside her offered an anchor of warmth that kept her from retreating entirely into her royal shell. Lord Magnus Eriksson emerged from the stairwell, his scarred face bearing the serious expression that had made him both feared and respected throughout the kingdom. Behind him came two of his trusted men, their hands resting casually on their sword hilts in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and vaguely threatening. Your Majesty, Magnus said, executing a bow that was precisely correct without being particularly warm. Forgive the intrusion, but there are matters that require your immediate attention. What matters? Sigrún asked, though something in Magnus's tone made her stomach tighten with anticipation of trouble. Reports have reached us from our southern borders. King Olaf's scouts have been seen in increasing numbers, and our spies in his court speak of troop movements that suggest more than routine patrols. Magnus's gaze flicked briefly to Bjorn, his expression unreadable. There are also concerns closer to home that we must discuss. The weight of his words settled over the tower room like a storm cloud. King Olaf had been testing their borders for years, probing for weaknesses, seeking any excuse to expand his territory at their expense. But the timing of this intelligence, combined with Magnus's meaningful look, suggested that political complications were multiplying faster than military ones. Speak plainly, Magnus, Sigrún commanded, her voice taking on the authority that had cowed rebellious nobles and foreign ambassadors alike. What concerns you about matters close to home? Your Majesty, Magnus began carefully, there are questions being raised about recent changes in your behavior. Some of your counselors wonder whether external pressures might be influencing your judgment in ways that could affect the kingdom's security. Bjorn had remained silent during this exchange, but Sigrún could feel the tension radiating from him, like heat from a forge. His warrior's instincts were clearly alert to the undercurrents of challenge in Magnus's words, though he made no move to interfere in what was clearly a matter of statecraft. Are you questioning my fitness to rule, Lord Magnus? Sigrún asked, her tone deceptively mild. I am expressing concern about the wisdom of forming close associations with individuals whose loyalties may not align with the kingdom's best interests, Magnus replied, his gaze now fixed directly on Bjorn, particularly when such associations become the subject of widespread speculation that undermines the dignity of the crown. The accusation hung in the air between them like a drawn blade. Sigrún felt anger flare in her chest, not just at Magnus's implication, but at the familiar pattern of men assuming they knew better than she did what was best for her kingdom and herself. 20 years of proving her competence apparently counted for nothing when measured against 3 days of choosing her own companionship. Bjorn Thorsson has served this kingdom with honor for more than 2 decades, she said, her voice carrying the edge that made veteran warriors step back. His loyalty has been proven in blood on a dozen battlefields. What exactly do you suggest? His presence here threatens. I suggest nothing, Your Majesty. I merely observe that the timing of King Olaf's increased aggression coincides with other changes that may not be coincidental. Magnus's tone remained respectful, but his meaning was clear. Sigrun's judgment was compromised, and the kingdom was suffering for it. Bjorn stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled in the way that marked dangerous men who had learned to govern their tempers through necessity. Lord Magnus, he said quietly, if you have concerns about my loyalty or intentions, I would prefer you address them to me directly, rather than cloaking accusations in diplomatic language. The 2 men faced each other across the small tower room, and Sigrún realized she was witnessing something far more complex than a simple challenge to her authority. This was about power, about the traditional structures that governed relationships between queens and their subjects, about the threat that genuine emotional connection posed to the careful balance of fear and respect that held kingdoms together. Very well, Magnus said, his scarred face settling into the expression he wore before battles. I question whether a warrior who grows soft in his later years, who speaks of mercy and restraint when strength is required, is fit to influence decisions that will determine whether this kingdom survives the coming storm. The words struck Bjorn like physical blows, but his response was measured and calm. And I question whether a lord who cannot distinguish between strength and wisdom has learned anything from the battles he has survived. Sigrún stood, placing herself between the 2 men before their confrontation could escalate beyond words. The runestone map lay forgotten on the table behind her, its ancient symbols suddenly seeming less like a guide to safe passage and more like a reminder of how quickly even the most carefully planned journeys could become dangerous. Enough, she said, her voice carrying absolute authority. Magnus, your concerns are noted and will be addressed, but they will be addressed by me, as your queen, not through challenges to those I choose to honor with my friendship. Magnus bowed, but his eyes remained fixed on Bjorn, with the calculating gaze of a predator marking prey. As you wish, Your Majesty. But remember that loyalty flows both ways, and that those who truly serve your interests sometimes must speak uncomfortable truths. After he departed, Sigrún and Bjorn stood in the sudden silence of the tower room, both understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. They were no longer simply 2 people discovering an unexpected connection. They were now political complications in each other's lives, symbols of choices that others would use to measure their fitness and loyalty. The War Council had lasted well into the evening, filled with heated discussions of troop movements and defensive strategies. But it was the conversation afterward, in Sigrún's private chambers, that truly mattered. King Olaf's threat loomed larger with each passing day. Scouts reported at least 3,000 warriors massing near the southern border, while supply trains suggested preparations for an extended campaign rather than mere raiding. Bjorn stood before the great table, where maps of the kingdom lay, spread like a patchwork of possibilities and dangers, his weathered finger tracing potential invasion routes with the expertise of a man who had both planned and repelled such attacks. Despite the political tensions that Magnus had introduced, Sigrún found herself grateful for Bjorn's tactical knowledge. His years of warfare had taught him to see landscapes not just as territory, but as living battlefields, where geography could determine the fate of nations. Olaf will avoid the eastern approach, Bjorn said, marking key positions with small, carved, wooden pieces. The marshlands there favor defenders, and he knows our archers are skilled. He'll come through the western valleys, where his cavalry can operate effectively. Sigrún nodded, studying his analysis. Which means we need to evacuate the outlying settlements and concentrate our forces at Ironhold Pass. but that leaves nearly 1,000 families homeless just as winter approaches. War demands such sacrifices, Bjorn agreed, though his tone suggested he took no pleasure in the necessity. The alternative is to let those families face Olaf's warriors with nothing but farming tools and hope. The loom that had belonged to Sigrun's mother stood in the corner of her chambers, its wooden frame worn smooth by generations of use. Tonight, she found her eyes drawn to it repeatedly, remembering her mother's patient hands working the threads, the quiet wisdom that had emerged during those long hours of steady, careful labor. Her mother had often said that ruling a kingdom was like weaving, each decision a thread that would strengthen or weaken the whole, each choice requiring attention to both the immediate pattern and the larger design. My mother would have known. "What to do?" Sigrún said softly, moving to touch the loom's frame. She had a gift for seeing how individual choices would affect the larger pattern. When the grain harvest failed in the 3rd year of my father's reign, she convinced him to open the royal granaries, not just to prevent starvation, but because she understood that hungry people become desperate people, and desperate people make poor choices that can unravel an entire kingdom. Bjorn looked up from the battle maps, his attention caught by something in her voice. "And you believe you lack that gift?" "I know how to make the hard choices that leadership demands," she replied, her fingers tracing the threads that stretched across the loom's frame. "I can order evacuations and troop movements, calculate supply needs and defensive positions. But my mother could see the human cost of every decision before it was made, could find ways to achieve necessary goals while minimizing suffering." "Perhaps," Bjorn suggested gently, "she had the luxury of advising rather than commanding. It's easier to see the full pattern when you're not the one whose signature orders men to die." Sigrún turned from the loom to find him watching her with an expression of understanding that caught her off guard. In the soft light of the oil lamps that illuminated her chambers, the harsh lines of his battle-scarred features seemed gentler, more thoughtful. "Tell me about your family," she said impulsively. "Not the warrior's tales, but the personal history. What shaped you before you learned to kill?" Bjorn set down the wooden piece he had been holding, his attention shifting entirely to her. "My parents were farmers originally, before my father was called to serve in King Eric's wars. They found each other late in life. He was 38, she was 35, both considered too old for love by most standards. What brought them together? A shared understanding of loneliness," Bjorn replied with a slight smile. "My father had lost his first wife in childbirth, along with their son. My mother had cared for her aging parents until they passed, then found herself alone with a small farm and no clear future. They married not for passion or political advantage, but for companionship and the hope that two people might build something meaningful together." Sigrún felt her heart clench at the parallels to her own situation. And did they build something meaningful? They had 15 years together before the fever took them both in the same winter. 15 years of shared work, quiet conversations. By the fire, small acts of daily kindness that mattered more than grand gestures. Bjorn's eyes grew distant with memory. "They taught me that love doesn't always arrive with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it grows like grain, slowly, steadily, requiring patience and tending to reach full harvest." The intimacy of his words seemed to charge the air between them, and Sigrún realized that their conversations about strategy and statecraft had become a kind of courtship, each shared confidence bringing them closer to something neither had dared name directly. "Bjorn," she said softly, moving closer to where he stood beside the battle maps. "When this crisis with Olaf is resolved, what will you do? Will you return to Eric and the warrior's life?" Or her words were cut off as he reached for her, his calloused hands gentle on her face as he drew her toward him. Their first kiss was tentative, questioning, both of them acutely aware that this moment would change everything between them. But as Sigrún's arms came up to circle his neck, as she felt the steady warmth of his body against hers, she realized that some changes were worth embracing regardless of their consequences. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Sigrún rested her forehead against his chest and listened to the rapid beating of his heart. "I have no answer for what comes after," Bjorn said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "But I know that I want to face whatever challenges arise. As your partner, not simply as another warrior in your service, even if it means standing against those who question your loyalty. Even if Magnus and others like him make your life here impossible." Bjorn's arms tightened around her, protective and reassuring. "I have faced worse enemies than political opposition, Sigrún, and I have never had a cause worth fighting for that mattered more than this." Outside her chambers, the castle settled into its nighttime routines. Guards walking their rounds, servants banking fires, the ordinary business of a kingdom continuing despite the extraordinary changes taking place in its queen's heart. But here, surrounded by battle maps and her mother's loom, with Bjorn's arms around her and the taste of their first kiss still warm on her lips, Sigrún felt for the first time in 20 years that she was exactly where she belonged. The war. With Olaf would come, the political challenges would multiply, and she would face them all as she always had, with courage, wisdom, and the determination to protect her people. But now she would not face them alone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the great hall as Lord Magnus approached the throne, but this time he did not come alone. Behind him walked a priest whose black robes marked him as a keeper of church records, and beside the priest, a young clerk clutched a leather satchel with the reverent care reserved for documents that could reshape kingdoms. Sigrún felt her heart sink even before Magnus spoke. She had been expecting another confrontation about her relationship with Bjorn, another challenge to her authority disguised as concern for the kingdom's welfare. But something in Magnus's bearing, triumphant rather than cautious, warned her that this meeting would prove far more dangerous than political maneuvering. "Your Majesty," Magnus began, his voice carrying across the hall with the authority of a man who believed he held the moral high ground. "I have come before you and your court with documents that require your immediate attention, documents that speak to matters of law, duty, and the sacred bonds that govern royal succession." The hidden marriage contract emerged from the clerk's satchel like a serpent uncoiling, parchment yellowed with age, but bearing seals that Sigrún recognized with growing horror. Harald's seal, pressed into red wax that had somehow survived. 15 years. The seal of the Archbishop of Uppsala, whose blessing made marriages binding in both earthly and divine law. And her own seal, smaller and less elaborate, but unmistakably authentic. "This contract," Magnus continued, unrolling the document with ceremonial care, "was executed in the final year of King Harald's reign. It establishes a betrothal between myself and Queen Sigrún to be consummated within 1 year of the king's death, should he die without male heir." The hall erupted in whispers, courtiers leaning toward each other to share their shock and speculation. But Sigrún heard nothing except the pounding of her own pulse as memories crashed over her like winter waves against stone cliffs. Harald's final illness, the fever that had consumed him slowly over months while she nursed him through delirium and pain. Those last desperate weeks when he had signed countless documents, making provisions for succession, ensuring the kingdom's stability after his death. She remembered signing papers at his bedside, her attention focused entirely on his labored breathing rather than the legal language that clerks had placed before her. Papers concerning trade agreements, military alliances, administrative appointments, and yes, somewhere among them, this document that she had signed without reading, trusting Harald's judgment, even as grief clouded her thinking. "I don't remember," she whispered, though the words carried clearly in the suddenly silent hall. Harald was dying, and I signed whatever his advisers placed before me." "Grief can certainly cloud memory," Magnus agreed with false sympathy, "but the law recognizes no such excuse. A queen's signature on a marriage contract creates obligations that transcend personal preference or emotional state." Bjorn stood rigid. Beside the throne, his hand instinctively moving toward Griefbiter's hilt before he remembered that weapons were forbidden in formal court sessions. Sigrún could see the muscles in his jaw working as he fought to control his reaction, understanding that any outburst would only make their situation worse. "The contract specifies certain conditions," the priest intoned, his voice carrying the weight of religious authority. "Should Queen Sigrún fail to honor this betrothal, the penalties include forfeiture of the southern provinces, including the 511 acres that were recently offered to another, and the right of Lord Magnus to claim succession should the Queen die without legitimate heir." The implications struck Sigrún like physical blows. Not only would breaking this contract strip away a third of her kingdom's most fertile territory, it would effectively make Magnus her heir, giving him every incentive to ensure she produced no children who might challenge his eventual claim to the throne. "This is unconscionable," Bjorn said quietly, his voice cutting through the murmur of courtly speculation. "No contract signed under such circumstances should be considered binding." Magnus turned toward him with the cold smile of a predator who had maneuvered his prey into an inescapable trap. "The law disagrees, warrior, but your concern is touching, considering your own role in violating the terms of this sacred agreement." "What do you mean?" Sigrún demanded, though part of her already knew what Magnus would say next. "The contract includes specific provisions regarding the Queen's conduct during the betrothal period. Adultery, or even the appearance of intimate association with another man, voids any claim to mercy or compromise. The penalties become absolute, the forfeiture immediate." The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the assembled courtier. Sigrún realized that Magnus had not simply discovered this contract, he had been planning this revelation, waiting for the perfect moment to use it as a weapon that would destroy both her relationship with Bjorn and her power as queen. "You orchestrated this," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "You've been watching, waiting for me to form an attachment that you could use against me." "I have been protecting this kingdom's interests," Magnus replied smoothly. "When I learned of your growing association with Thorsson, I felt compelled to research whether such behavior might have legal implications. I was as surprised as anyone to discover this forgotten contract." The lie was skillfully delivered, but Sigrún could see the calculation behind his eyes. Magnus had almost certainly known about the contract all along, had perhaps even been instrumental in having it included among the papers Harold had signed during his final illness. This was not the revelation of a forgotten document. It was the culmination of a plan that had been years in the making. "The terms are clear," the priest continued inexorably. "Lord Magnus may claim immediate fulfillment of the betrothal, along with the dowry properties specified in the contract. Any resistance to these terms will result in the forfeiture of territory and the transfer of succession rights." Sigrún looked at Bjorn, seeing in his grey eyes the same trapped feeling that clawed at her own chest. They had found each other. Across the loneliness that had defined their separate lives, had discovered in their connection something worth preserving and nurturing. But now that connection had become the weapon that their enemies would use to destroy them both. "There must be alternatives," she said, her mind racing through possibilities. "The contract was signed under duress during Harold's final illness. Surely there are grounds for legal challenge." "Church law recognizes no such challenges to properly witnessed and sealed documents," the priest replied, with finality. "The Archbishop's seal makes this a matter of divine as well as earthly law." Magnus stepped closer to the throne, his scarred face bearing an expression of triumph that he no longer bothered to disguise. "However, I am not without mercy, Your Majesty. I propose that we can resolve this matter in a way that honors both law and tradition." "What do you propose?" "Accept the betrothal and I will be generous in my interpretation of what constitutes appropriate dowry. The original 500 acres can be reduced to 200, and succession rights can be limited to the case of your death without any heir, legitimate or otherwise. The offer was carefully crafted to seem reasonable while actually giving Magnus everything he wanted: access to royal wealth, a legal claim on the throne, and the elimination of Bjorn as a rival for Sigrun's affections. And if I refuse, Magnus's smile grew colder, then the contract's penalties take effect immediately. The southern provinces are forfeit. Thorsson faces exile or worse for his role in violating a sacred betrothal, and you rule a diminished kingdom with a man who has legal claim to your throne, standing ready to challenge every decision you make. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of torches and the distant sounds of castle life continuing obliviously beyond the hall's great doors. Sigrún understood that she stood at a crossroads where every path led to loss. Her kingdom, her love, or her freedom to choose her own destiny. But as she looked at Bjorn, seeing in his steady gaze not panic or defeat, but the quiet strength that had first drawn her to him, she realized that Magnus had made one crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that the threat of loss would make her submit, that fear would overwhelm the connection she and Bjorn had discovered. He had not considered that some bonds, once forged in honesty and mutual respect, became stronger under pressure. Rather than weaker. I need time to consider your proposal, she said finally, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect for 20 years. Of course, Your Majesty, but not too much time. Winter approaches, and King Olaf's armies grow stronger with each passing day. The kingdom needs the stability that only a proper marriage can provide. As the court dispersed and Magnus departed, with his documents and his threats, Sigrún remained seated on her throne, staring at the space where the marriage contract had been displayed. The weight of the crown seemed heavier now, no longer a symbol of power, but a chain that bound her to choices others had made years before she could understand their consequences. The crown of the northern lands sat upon its ceremonial cushion, beside Sigrún's bed, its ancient gold catching the flickering candlelight like captured stars. Forged by her great-great-grandfather from metal, taken in the conquest of 7 kingdoms, it bore the weight of 4 centuries of rule, of countless decisions that had shaped the lives of thousands. Tonight, as Sigrún lay sleepless in her chambers, the crown seemed to pulse with the accumulated burden of every choice her predecessors had made, every sacrifice they had demanded of themselves and others. She had not slept since Magnus's revelation 3 days ago. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Harald's feverish face during those final weeks, remembered the trust in his dying gaze as he spoke of protecting the kingdom after his death. Had he known what he was asking of her when he included that marriage contract among the papers she signed? Had he believed that Magnus would make a suitable husband, or had he simply been desperate to ensure the kingdom's stability through any means necessary? The questions tormented her because she would never know the answers. Harald was 15, years dead, his motivations buried with him, leaving her to face the consequences of decisions made in grief and desperation. A soft knock at her chamber door interrupted her brooding. "Enter," she called, not bothering to rise from where she sat by the window, still wearing the simple wool dress she had donned at dawn. Astrid entered bearing a tray of untouched food, the 3rd such offering Sigrún had ignored since the previous morning. Her oldest friend and most trusted advisor set the tray aside and settled into a chair facing the window seat where the Queen maintained her vigil. "You cannot continue like this," Astrid said gently. "The kingdom needs a ruler who can think clearly, not one consumed by impossible choices." "Are they impossible?" Sigrún asked, her gaze fixed on the courtyard below, where dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of grey and gold. "Or am I simply too proud to accept the path that duty demands?" "Magnus is not Harald," Astrid replied firmly. "He never will be. regardless of what legal documents say. You cannot honor your late husband's memory by sacrificing yourself to a man who sees you only as a stepping stone to power. Sigrún finally turned from the window, studying her friend's weathered face. Astrid had served the royal household for 40 years, had watched kingdoms rise and fall, had seen enough of human nature to understand the difference between love and ambition. But what of the kingdom? Sigrún asked. If I refuse Magnus's claim, we lose the southern provinces, just as King Olaf masses his armies for invasion. We face external enemies with reduced strength and internal division. How many will die because I chose personal happiness over political necessity? And how many will suffer under a ruler who gained power through extortion and manipulation? Astrid countered. Magnus has shown you who he is, Sigrún. Believe him. Before Sigrún could respond, another knock echoed through the chamber. This time, Bjorn entered without waiting for permission, his presence filling the room with the quiet strength that had become her anchor in the storm of political upheaval. He had spent the past 3 days preparing for war, sharpening weapons, drilling with the castle guards, reviewing defensive positions, but she could see in his grey eyes that the external battle worried him less than the internal one she was fighting. I've come to a decision, he announced without preamble, his voice carrying the finality of a man who had weighed all options and found his path. Sigrún felt her heart clench with anticipation of what he might say. Bjorn, I'm leaving, he continued, cutting off her protest. Today, before the morning meal, I'll take Eric and whatever men are willing to follow me, and we'll seek service with King Ragnar in the Eastern Kingdoms. My presence here has become a liability you cannot afford. The words hit her like physical blows, each one stripping away another piece of the hope she had been fighting to preserve. You would abandon me? After everything we've shared, everything we've discovered together? Bjorn crossed to where she sat and knelt beside her chair, his calloused hands gentle on her arms. I would free you to make the choice that saves your kingdom. If I remove myself from consideration, Magnus loses his most powerful weapon against you. You can negotiate with him from a position of strength rather than desperation. And what of us? She whispered, tears threatening for the first time since this crisis began. What of the connection we've built, the partnership we've discovered? It will remain here, he said, touching his hand to his chest. Always. But some things matter more than personal happiness, and you taught me that wisdom. Your people need their queen to be free to act in their best interests, not trapped by affection for a warrior whose presence makes her vulnerable to political manipulation. Astrid cleared her throat gently. There may be another option, she said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had been thinking deeply about seemingly impossible problems. The old laws, from before the time of written contracts and church oversight. There are precedents that might serve us, both. Sigrún and Bjorn turned toward her with sudden attention. Trial by combat, Astrid continued. When the legitimacy of a marriage contract is disputed, when there are questions of coercion or fraud, the old laws provide for resolution through single combat. The theory being that divine justice will favor the righteous cause. Sigrún felt her heart begin to race. Magnus would never agree to such a trial. He gains everything through the contract as it stands. Why would he risk combat? Because, Astrid said with a slight smile, the challenge must come from the party claiming injury. If Bjorn formally accuses Magnus of obtaining the contract through fraud and challenges him to prove its legitimacy through combat, Magnus cannot refuse without appearing cowardly before the entire court. It's too dangerous, Sigrún protested. Immediately, Magnus is 20 years younger than Bjorn, hungry for glory, desperate to prove himself, and if Bjorn loses, you marry Magnus as the contract demands. Astrid finished calmly. But if he wins, the contract is declared void, obtained through fraudulent means, and you are free to choose your own path. Bjorn had remained silent during this exchange, But now he stood slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than fearful. "I have fought younger men before," he said quietly. "Youth brings strength and speed, but age brings cunning and patience. The outcome would not be predetermined. I cannot ask you to risk your life for my freedom," Sigrún said, rising to face him directly. "If something happened to you, if Magnus's blade found its mark, I could never forgive myself." Bjorn's hands cupped her face with infinite gentleness. "And I could never forgive myself if I walked away without fighting for what we've discovered together. Some things are worth dying for, Sigrún. You have taught me that not all battles are fought for gold and territory. Some are fought for the right to choose love over duty, partnership over political convenience." The three of them stood in the growing morning light, surrounded by the trappings of royal power, but focused entirely on human choices that would determine not just political outcomes, but the shape of whatever years remained to them. The crown seemed to watch from its cushion, a silent witness to the moment when personal courage would be tested against political expediency. "If we do this," Sigrún said slowly, "there can be no retreat, no compromise. Trial by combat means accepting whatever outcome the gods decree." "I accept those terms," Bjorn replied without hesitation. "Magnus will try to refuse," Astrid warned. "He'll claim the challenge is invalid, that Bjorn has no legal standing to dispute a royal marriage contract." "Then we make the challenge public," Sigrún decided, her voice taking on the authority that had commanded respect for 20 years. "Before the full court, with witnesses from neighboring kingdoms. Let Magnus refuse honor and combat before an audience that includes his potential allies and enemies. Let him explain to other nobles why he fears to face a single opponent when he claims the right to rule through legal manipulation." Bjorn smiled, the expression transforming his battle-scarred features into something approaching joy. "When do we make this challenge?" "Today," Sigrún replied, moving toward her wardrobe where her most formal robes awaited. "At the noon assembly. If we're going to stake everything on trial by combat, let's do it properly, with all the ceremony that tradition demands." As she began to dress for what might prove to be the most important court session of her reign, Sigrún caught sight of herself in the polished bronze mirror that Harold had given her during the early years of their marriage. The woman looking back at her bore the lines and silver hair that marked her age, but her eyes held a fire that had been missing for months, the flame of someone who had rediscovered what was worth fighting for. In a few hours, she would stand before her court and formally challenge the marriage contract that threatened to steal her future. In a few hours, Bjorn would face Magnus in combat that could end in death or victory, freedom or bondage. In a few hours, they would learn whether love backed by courage could overcome law backed by manipulation. But first, she would spend these remaining moments of uncertainty, holding fast to the connection that had transformed them both from isolated individuals into something stronger, two people who had learned that the greatest courage sometimes lay not in accepting duty, but in fighting for the right to choose their own destiny. The ancient dueling circle lay in the meadow beyond the castle walls, a ring of standing stones that had witnessed the resolution of honor disputes for more than 3 centuries. Each granite monolith stood twice the height of a man, carved with runes that spoke of justice, courage, and the belief that divine providence would guide the outcome of mortal combat. As dawn broke across the kingdom on what might prove to be its most consequential day, these stones seemed to lean inward expectantly, as if the very earth understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Word of the trial by combat had spread through the castle and surrounding villages with the speed of wildfire. By the time the sun cleared the eastern hills, hundreds of witnesses had gathered around the sacred circle, nobles and commoners alike, drawn by the unprecedented spectacle of a queen's freedom being decided by sword and shield. Never in living memory had such personal stakes been wedded to such public ceremony. Queen Sigrún stood at the circle's eastern edge, wearing the formal robes of royal judgment, deep blue wool trimmed with silver thread and fastened with brooches, that had belonged to her grandmother. But it was not her finery that commanded attention. It was the steel in her bearing, the way she carried herself like a woman who had wagered everything on a single throw of the dice and found peace in the courage required for such a gamble. Beside her stood Astrid and Eric, the latter having arrived at first light, with Bjorn's battle gear and words of encouragement that carried the weight of 20 years of shared warfare. The old warrior's weathered face bore expressions of both pride and concern as he watched his shield brother prepare for combat that would determine far more than personal honor. At the circle's western edge, Lord Magnus paced like a caged wolf, his scarred features twisted with fury that his careful political maneuvering had been reduced to the ancient brutality of single combat. He had tried every legal argument to avoid this confrontation, claiming the challenge was invalid, that church law superseded ancient tradition, that matters of royal succession could not be settled by bloodshed. But Sigrún had outmaneuvered him, making the challenge before witnesses from 3 neighboring kingdoms and invoking precedents that even the church could not easily dismiss. The priest who had revealed the marriage contract stood with Magnus, his black robes making him appear like a raven perched among the colorful crowd. His presence lent religious authority to Magnus's claim, but it could not shield him from the physical reality of combat. "My queen," came a familiar voice, and Sigrún turned to see Bjorn approaching through the gathered crowd. He wore the battle gear of a veteran warrior, mail shirt polished to gleaming silver, leather braces studded with iron, a helm that bore the dents and scratches of countless previous encounters. At his side hung Griefbiter, the sword that had carried him through 2 decades of warfare and would now determine whether their love story ended in triumph or tragedy. But it was not his weapons or armor that drew her attention. It was his eyes. Calm, steady, holding no trace of fear despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. This was a man who had made peace with whatever outcome the next hour might bring, who had found in this moment not the terror of potential death, but the satisfaction of fighting for something that mattered more than mere survival. "Are you ready?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his bearing. "I have been ready since the moment you offered me your trust instead of your gold," he replied, his voice carrying clearly across the circle to where Magnus and his supporters waited. The formal ceremonies began with the rising sun. A herald read the terms of combat: single weapons, no shields, fight until death or yield, the outcome to be accepted as divine judgment on the legitimacy of the disputed marriage contract. Magnus had chosen a war axe, its wide blade polished, to mirror brightness, a weapon that favored strength and aggression over finesse. Bjorn had selected a sword, the familiar weight of Griefbiter offering comfort that no amount of prayer could match. "Lords and ladies, people of the realm," Sigrún called out, her voice carrying across the meadow with the authority that had commanded respect for 20 years. "We gather this morning to witness justice done according to the ancient ways. Let no one claim that what unfolds here lacks legitimacy or divine sanction." She walked to the center of the stone circle, where tradition demanded that the disputing parties state their cases one final time before combat commenced. "Lord Magnus," she began, her tone formal but edged with steel, "you claim the right to my hand in marriage based upon a contract signed during my late husband's final illness. You say that this document represents his will and divine law." Magnus stepped forward, his grip tight on his axe handle. "I claim what is rightfully mine by law and sacred oath, Your Majesty. The contract bears your seal as well as the king's. No, duress can void what was freely given." "And you, Bjorn Thorsson," Sigrún continued, turning toward the man whose courage had given her the strength to risk everything. "What is your claim in this matter?" Bjorn drew Griefbiter, the ancient steel singing as it cleared its sheath. The blade caught the morning light, reflecting it back toward the gathered crowd like a promise made manifest in metal. I claim that this contract was obtained through deception and manipulation, he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the circle. I claim that no true marriage can be built upon such foundations, and that divine justice will favor those who choose love over law, honor over ambition. The stones seemed to hum with anticipation as the two men took their positions within the sacred circle. Around them, hundreds of witnesses held their breath, understanding that they were about to witness either the triumph of authentic connection over political manipulation, or its destruction beneath the weight of legal tradition and youthful strength. Magnus raised his axe, sunlight gleaming along its cruel edge. Bjorn held Griefbiter in the guard position his father had taught him 40 years ago. Between them lay not just the possibility of death, but the future of a kingdom and the fate of a love that had transformed two lonely souls into something greater than either could have been alone. The battle began with Magnus's roar of fury. As he charged across the stone circle, his war axe sweeping in a deadly arc that would have cleaved a younger man in two. But Bjorn was no longer young, and the lessons of 40 years of combat had taught him that survival often depended more on patience than on strength. He stepped aside at the last possible moment, letting Magnus's momentum carry him past while Griefbiter traced a shallow line across his opponent's ribs, first blood to the older warrior, though the crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered for the skillful defense, others murmured concern that Bjorn was merely delaying the inevitable. Magnus was indeed 20 years younger, his muscles unmarked by the accumulated wear of decades in battle, his reflexes still sharp. With the confidence of a man who had never truly faced defeat. "Is that all, old man?" Magnus snarled, wheeling to face Bjorn again. "I expected more from the mighty Thorsson." Bjorn made no reply, conserving his breath and energy while studying his opponent's fighting style. Magnus favored aggressive, overwhelming attacks, putting his full strength behind each swing of the axe. It was an effective strategy against most opponents, but it carried risks that experience could exploit. The second exchange came more cautiously, Magnus having learned to respect his opponent's speed despite his age. The axe blade whistled through the air in controlled arcs while Bjorn wove around the attacks like a dancer, his sword flickering out to probe for openings without committing to decisive strikes. To untrained eyes, it might have appeared that he was losing ground, giving way before Magnus's relentless pressure. But Sigrún, watching from beyond the circle's edge, recognized what Bjorn was doing. He was learning his opponent's rhythm, discovering the subtle tells that preceded each attack, mapping the patterns that even the most skilled warriors fell into under stress. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the man she loved risk everything for her freedom. But she forced herself to remain still, to trust in the wisdom that had carried him through 2 decades of warfare. Eric stood beside her, his weathered hands clenched into fists as he watched his shield brother fight. "Come on, you stubborn bastard," he muttered under his breath. "Show them what old wolves can do." The tide began to turn when Magnus, frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow, overcommitted to a massive overhead strike that would have split Bjorn from crown to groin. Instead, Bjorn sidestepped and brought Griefbiter around in a diagonal slash that opened a deep gash along Magnus's sword arm. The younger man staggered, his grip on the axe momentarily weakened by pain and flowing blood. But Magnus was no coward, whatever his other faults. He shifted the axe to his left hand and continued fighting, though his attacks now lacked the precision and power that had marked the battle's opening moments. Sweat ran down his scarred face, mixing with blood from the shallow cut Bjorn had opened across his cheek. "Yield," Bjorn said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed circle. "You've fought with honor, but this can only end one way now." "Never," Magnus gasped, launching himself forward in a desperate gambit that relied more on fury than skill. It was then that Bjorn reached for his grandfather's shield. Not a physical shield, for this was single-weapon combat, but the defensive techniques that had been passed down through generations of his family. His grandfather had been a master of the art that turned an opponent's strength against himself, that found victory not through overwhelming force, but through patience and perfect timing. Magnus's final charge became his downfall. Bjorn stepped into the attack rather than away from it, inside the axe's arc, where its blade could not reach him. His shoulder struck Magnus in the chest, while Griefbiter's pommel connected with his opponent's temple. The younger man crumpled to his knees, the war axe falling from nerveless fingers to ring against the stone ground. Bjorn stood over his defeated opponent, the point of his sword resting lightly against Magnus's throat. A single thrust would end. The contest permanently would eliminate any future threat to Sigrún's happiness or the kingdom's stability. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see whether mercy or practicality would guide the victor's choice. "I yield," Magnus whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the silence. "I acknowledge defeat." The circle erupted in cheers as Bjorn stepped back, lowering his sword and extending a hand to help Magnus to his feet. It was a gesture that spoke to something deeper than mere victory. The recognition that courage in defeat deserved respect, that honor could be maintained even in loss. Magnus accepted the offered hand, allowing Bjorn to help him stand, despite the pain of his wounds. When he spoke, his voice carried a grudging respect that had been entirely absent before the combat began. "You fight like the legends say, Thorsson. I understand now why she chose you over golden titles." Sigrún broke from the crowd of witnesses, unable to maintain royal dignity when the man she loved had just risked everything for her freedom. She ran to Bjorn, throwing her arms around him without regard for the blood that stained his mail shirt or the hundreds of eyes that watched their reunion. "It's finished," he said quietly, holding her against his chest while his heartbeat gradually slowed from the rapid rhythm of combat. "You're free to choose your own path." Around them, the ancient stones stood silent, witness to justice accomplished through courage rather than law, to love that had proven stronger than political manipulation, to the triumph of those who dared to fight for their right to write their own story rather than accept the one that others had written for them. 6 months had passed since the morning, when steel rang against steel in the ancient circle, since divine justice had spoken through the victory of an aging warrior over a younger rival. The castle's private chapel, small and intimate compared to the great hall, where Sigrún had once offered land for a single night, glowed with the warm light of beeswax candles as the kingdom's most unconventional couple prepared to exchange vows that would bind them not through political necessity, but through the deep connection they had discovered in the midst of loneliness and duty. The new wedding rings rested upon the altar, simple bands forged from metal taken from both their histories. Bjorn's contribution had come from Griefbiter. The sword retired after their victory in the dueling circle and melted down to create something that spoke of transformation rather than warfare. Sigrún's ring bore metal from the crown that had once seemed like a barrier between herself and authentic human connection, now transformed into a symbol of unity that honored both her royal responsibilities and her personal choice. The chapel held only their closest companions. Astrid stood as witness, tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks as she watched the woman she had served for decades finally claim the happiness that 20 years of ruling had denied her. Eric was there as well, grinning with the satisfaction of a man who had watched his shield brother discover that the greatest victories were not won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when two hearts recognized their perfect match. Even Magnus attended, though his presence spoke more to political wisdom than personal affection. The trial by combat had settled the legal questions surrounding Sigrún's freedom, but it had also demonstrated that the kingdom could survive unconventional choices when they were made with courage and honor. In the months following his defeat, Magnus had proven himself a valuable ally rather than a bitter enemy. Understanding that his own future prosperity depended upon the kingdom's stability rather than his personal ambitions. "My friends," the priest began, his voice carrying none of the cold authority that had marked his revelation of the marriage contract months before, "we gather today not to witness the fulfillment of legal obligations, but to celebrate the triumph of love that has been tested by adversity and found worthy of blessing." Sigrún looked across the narrow space that separated her from Bjorn and marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. The woman who had once offered a warrior 500 acres of land for a single night's companionship had learned that authentic connection could not be purchased, could not be demanded, could only be freely given by two people who saw in each other something worth cherishing and protecting. "I, Sigrún, take you, Bjorn, not as my subject or my conquest, but as my equal partner in whatever years remain to us," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "I promise to honor your wisdom, to share both the burdens and joys of ruling, and to never again let the crown become a barrier between my heart and the one who sees me most clearly." Bjorn's response came with the same quiet strength that had marked every significant moment in their relationship. "I, Bjorn, take you, Sigrún, not as my queen to be served, but as my companion in the life we will build together. I promise to stand beside you in times of peace and war, to remind you that you are more than the titles you carry, and to love you not for what you can give me, but for who you choose to be when the ceremonies end and we face each day as simply ourselves." As they exchanged rings forged from their separate histories, Sigrún felt the weight of transformation settling over her life like a comfortable cloak. The kingdom had not collapsed because she chose love over political convenience. The threats that had seemed so dire months before had proven manageable when faced by two people working in partnership rather than in isolation. King Olaf's invasion had never materialized, his armies melting away when faced with the prospect of fighting a united kingdom rather than one torn by internal division. The southern provinces remained securely under Sigrún's rule, their productivity increased by the stability that came from having leaders who governed through shared wisdom rather than individual ambition. The months following their wedding brought a transformation that reached far beyond the royal chambers. Sigrún found that ruling became less of a burden when she had a partner who understood both the weight of difficult decisions and the importance of maintaining perspective about what truly mattered. Bjorn discovered that his years of warfare had prepared him not just for battle, but for the strategic thinking and careful negotiation that effective governance required. Their daily routine reflected the balance they had found between duty and personal connection. Mornings began with walks through the gardens where Sigrún had first shared her deepest fears, their conversations weaving together matters of state with observations about the changing seasons and the small pleasures of shared companionship. Evenings often found them in the great hall, but now the chess set that had marked their early relationship sat between two chairs placed side by side rather than across from each other, symbolizing their evolution from opponents testing each other's measure to partners facing challenges together. "Do you ever regret it?" Bjorn asked one evening as they sat before the fire that had witnessed their first honest conversation. "Choosing this path instead of the security that conventional choices might have provided?" Sigrún smiled, her fingers intertwined with his as they watched the flames dance across the ancient dragon carvings that had overseen so many royal conversations across the centuries. "I regret the years I spent believing that duty and happiness were incompatible, that a queen must choose between ruling effectively and living authentically. And now?" Now I understand what my mother tried to teach me through her weaving, that the strongest patterns come from threads that support, rather than compete with each other. That true strength lies not in isolation, but in the connections we choose to honor and protect. Outside their chamber windows, the kingdom settled into the comfortable rhythms of a realm at peace with itself. Guards walked their rounds, but without the tension that had marked the months of political uncertainty. Farmers worked their fields knowing that their harvests would be fairly distributed, their taxes reasonably assessed by rulers who understood that prosperity shared was prosperity multiplied. The rings on their fingers caught the firelight, metal, transformed from instruments of war and symbols of isolation into bonds that spoke of partnership, understanding, and the courage required to choose love over convention. In the end, the wealthy queen had offered a warrior far more than land. She had offered him a place in a life worth living, and he had given her something equally precious in return, the reminder that even queens could dare to be simply fully human.